That was great, wasn't it? I'm glad you got there, buddy. That was a good mix too, wasn't it? Meeting will come to order. I want to thank everyone for being here this morning for our first ever hearing to examine how forest and wood products absorb and store carbon emissions and the role that forest management can play in addressing climate change. For years now, I've advocated for Congress to focus on climate solutions, particularly solutions that bring people together rather than drive us apart. We need solutions that both parties can rally behind, and I believe this morning's topic is unique because the solutions that we will be discussing not only enable all of us to do that, but they can also make a tremendous impact in our nation's carbon efforts. Today, I look forward to breaking through the rhetoric to hear what the science is telling us. For example, each of us saw the wildfires last year that burned over 4 million acres in California. That's a lot. Aside from the catastrophic loss of life and property, those fires alone generated 25% more carbon emissions than all of California's man-made carbon emissions combined. It's critical that we include forest and wildfires in our conversations about carbon emissions. Our committee has talked at length about how many of our country's forests are unhealthy and in need of restoration. But when you look at the problem through a carbon lens, things really come into focus. For example, beginning just in the last couple years, the forests of many western states now emit more carbon because of insect outbreaks and wildfires than they absorb. Let me say this another way. According to the latest Forest Service data, the forests of Colorado, Idaho, Montana, New Mexico, Texas, and yes, our beloved Wyoming, used to be carbon sinks, but are now carbon sources. However, scientists are telling us that if we proactively manage our forests, we can not only prevent emissions from wildfires, but we can also increase the amount of carbon we are sequestering and storing now. Tree planting is a classic example of a type of activity that can result in more carbon being sequestered and stored than if land was simply left alone. In West Virginia, we do not do much tree planting because most forest managers are able to regenerate their forest naturally. But there are currently 81 million acres of productive forest land across the U.S. that lack adequate trees and are in need of reforestation. I also want to briefly touch on the new technologies that we now have at hand with regards to forest products. We are now able to use wood products in a manner today that is different than ever before. And with technologies like cross-laminated timber, we can now store orders of magnitude more carbon in the construction materials used to frame our buildings. Additionally, I'm told that aside from storing more carbon, total global emissions could be cut by 15 to 20% if these technologies were used in construction. I'm proud to say that my home state of West Virginia is a national leader in the use of cross-laminated timber. Franklin Elementary School in Pendleton County, West Virginia, was the first school in the country to be entirely built using cross-laminated timber. Town leaders set out to build a school that would last and be economical, and end up building a state-of-the-art school with tremendous carbon benefits. While our witnesses will undoubtedly speak to the possibility of constructing projects like this nationwide, I also want to stress the opportunities that this technology can bring to rural areas in the way of local manufacturing. This morning, we were looking to discuss common sense solutions based on science that both sides of the aisle can get behind. We would like to establish a consensus of facts that we can use to guide our committee's work this Congress. As we review and take up bills related to forest and to climate change, we have a great panel assembled this morning. Each of these experts are known for being innovative, solution-oriented leaders in their field. And with that, I'll turn over to my friend, Ranking Member John Barrasso, for his opening statement.
Well, thanks so much, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership on this and for holding today's very important hearing. Our forests do play, as you just said, a vital role on so many fronts. Healthy forests provide habitat for wildlife. They also improve soil and water quality, and of course, they yield timber that is fundamental to our economy and our way of life. Healthy forests also sequester significant amounts of carbon from the atmosphere. At the same time, our forests have become, as you said, a significant source of fuel for wildfires. The lack of active forest management has turned many of our nation's forests into tinderboxes. It's created a perfect storm for widespread, catastrophic wildfires. Last summer was devastating wildfire season all across America. In Wyoming, we had one of the largest wildfires on record. The Mullen Fire wreaked havoc through Carbon and Albany counties. was estimated to span 25 miles north to south, 23 miles east to west, and burned over 175,000 acres. It forced numerous evacuations. It destroyed dozens of homes and buildings, and it left a price tag of almost $33 million. In addition to endangering lives and damaging property and destroying habitat, the increased intensity and frequency of catastrophic megafires has disrupted many of the ecological benefits that we have gained from our forests. These megafires have resulted in increased carbon emissions and reduced air quality. A Bloomberg story published in January reported that California's 2020 wildfire emissions were equal to the greenhouse emissions of over 24 million passenger cars. So if people are concerned, rightly so, about climate change, carbon emissions, and clean air, they should be very concerned about our burning forests. Forest Service Chief Vicki Christensen recently testified that her agency must accelerate its active forest management efforts and that a paradigm shift is needed now. I agree completely. According to the Forest Service, 63 million acres of our national forests are at high or very high risk of being consumed in a catastrophic fire. In addition, sawmills, which carry out hazardous fuels reduction projects, are struggling. The Forest Service sells well below the allowable sale quantity of timber called for in its forest plans. Continuing this practice is going to lead to more timber mills closing down, and this is going to hurt local economies as well as leave our forests vulnerable to ongoing problems with fire and with disease. In recent years, the Black Hills National Forest, which spans Wyoming and South Dakota, has failed to meet its timber targets. And since our local sawmills rely on the National Forest for most of their timber supplies, this failure has led directly to the closure of a sawmill in South Dakota. Worse, some within the Forest Service are recommending further and permanent reductions in harvest levels on the Black Hills. This would devastate our local mills and make it very difficult to manage timber in and around the forest going forward. That's why in March, I, along with members of the Wyoming and South Dakota congressional delegations, sent a letter to the Forest Service. The letter outlines our concerns with the recommended timber for harvest reduction, and it encourages better cooperation between the Forest Service and the local officials and stakeholders. In addition to reducing emissions through active forest management, we should also be mindful of ways we can sequester carbon by planting more trees and vegetation. We should also look for more ways to permanently store carbon in harvested wood products. While I was chairman of the Environment and Public Works Committee, my bill, the Use It Act, was signed into law by President Trump. This law supports groundbreaking innovation to address climate change through carbon capture and utilization technologies. I believe there is ample room for increased carbon sequestered efforts in the forestry space as well. So I look forward to exploring that topic here at the Energy and Natural Resources Committee. Thanks again, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to today's hearing and testimony.
Thank you, Senator Barrasso. And let me now welcome our panel of witnesses, and we've been very pleased to have such an expert panel. Ms. Mary Mitsos of the National Forest Foundation, who is with us in person. Dr. Tom Crowther, who I understand is the chief architect behind the United Nations Trillion Trees campaign. Ms. Jennifer Cover, president and CEO of Woodworks. Mr. Ben Woodkey, executive director of Intermountain Forest Association. And finally, Mr. Jim Irving, CEO of J.D. Irving Limited. So, Ms. Mitsos, we'll begin with your opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Manchin and Ranking Member Barrasso, for this opportunity. The National Forest Foundation is a congressionally chartered, non-advocacy nonprofit that works on behalf of the American public to ensure the health and resilience of our national forests and to inspire personal and meaningful connections to them. Working closely with the Forest Service, we create public-private partnerships to lead forest conservation efforts and promote responsible recreation. Each year, the NFF facilitates common ground, restores fish and wildlife habitat, reduces wildfire risk, plants trees, and improves recreational opportunities. Our nation's forests are an incredible resource. They provide jobs, fiber, clean air and water, hunting, fishing, and more. They also sequester hundreds of millions of tons of carbon dioxide every year, up to 15% of this country's annual emissions. National forests can and should be part of the solution to mitigating and adapting to climate change. However, as mentioned earlier, increasing wildfire threatens to shift millions of acres from a carbon sink into a carbon source. Forest restoration can reverse this trend. Healthy fire-resistant forests help maintain and increase long-term carbon storage capacity. While every forest requires tailored treatments, tools like forest thinning and prescribed fire can reduce fire risk and help retain forest cover. In places already affected by fire, tree planting helps ensure forests persist. The science of forest restoration is well established and widely practiced. What impedes this work is the cost at the scale needed. The Forest Service estimates around 80 million acres in the system require restoration at an average cost of about $1,000 per acre. That exceeds $80 billion today. Addressing this will require every tool available, including greater utilization of low-value wood products from restoration treatments, funding, and policies that unlock private investment for carbon offsets generated on NFS lands. The NFF works daily with the private sector on investments in our public lands. The interest is huge and growing. We create innovative solutions to match private funding with forest needs. For example, we're combining a multitude of partners, local governments, utilities, major corporations, philanthropy, and more, to support forest restoration in places like Arizona, California, and Colorado. One of the most common questions we get from our corporate partners is, can we get carbon offsets for this project? While we have the ability to track and calculate the carbon benefits, we do not currently have the authority to issue carbon offsets from projects on National Forest System lands. Voluntary carbon offsets from projects on are a common part of corporate goals to address their ESG. We currently lack the means to turn private sector interest in carbon offsets into significant investments to improve our public forests. If we could offer those offsets, it would be a game changer for restoring our forests. The NFF has piloted similar work in the past, and we have experience and relationships to work closely with the Forest Service. We are currently developing a first-of-its-kind methodology for generating offsets from restoration projects in high fire frequency forests. National Forest System lands offer an unparalleled opportunity for natural climate solutions, healthier communities, and resilient forests. This work creates common ground with shared benefits for local contractors, rural and regional economies, corporate partners pursuing climate goals, and the long-term health of our nation's forests. Thank you for this opportunity to share the National Forest Foundation's mission and our work. In closing, forest restoration, tree planting, and wood products are three great ways to store carbon.
Thank you, Ms. Missos. Next, we're going to go to Dr. Crowther for his opening remarks. Dr. Crowther?
Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Barrasso, thank you for the opportunity. I'm an ecologist living in Zurich in Switzerland, where there's an online coffee shop that I use that I really like. They, like many shops, get their beans from Ethiopia, but the shop is a bit different because they get their beans from trees that are planted in an agroforestry plantation. These trees are planted in sunny patches within a beautiful tropical forest. If you flew over the area with a plane, you wouldn't see a plantation, you'd see a flourishing forest. And because the surrounding ecosystems trap water and nutrients, the coffee grows really well without irrigation or fertilizers. So business is booming, and that obviously benefits the local community. Even schools in the area are now starting to protect patches of nearby forest, setting up their own agroforestry plantations within. We've obviously all got stories about the value of nature and how integral it is to human well-being and happiness and the quality of life. And there's an ever-growing scientific body of literature showing this strong correlation between ecosystem health and the stability of local economies and human well-being. But the value of nature is obviously important globally as well, because they store huge amounts of carbon. We're obviously beginning to learn the full extent of this potential. By building a new generation of models, we've been able to see that the Earth is home to about 3 trillion trees, which is about half of what originally was here. And we lose about 10 billion each year, which is contributing to our annual emissions. However, our maps also reveal that outside of urban and agricultural land, there's about 2.2 billion acres of degraded lands where forests could naturally regrow. If we could protect and revitalize such areas around the world, we realize there's room for just over 1 trillion new trees. And if those trees can be supported in the long term and grow to maturity, those ecosystems could capture up to 30% of the excess carbon that's in the atmosphere right now as a result of human activity. This revealed a massive potential, but honestly, it's not a new idea. Scientists have known that forests have this huge potential for a long time. So why have we failed to act until now? Well, first, the maps are useful for guiding decision making, but much more importantly, it's because there's huge risks that come with the process. And many scientists still have massive concerns about the potential for large-scale restoration. Because these concerns come from the idea that tree planting is an easy way out, and nothing could be further from the truth. First, it's clear that this is not a silver bullet. We can't just plant a few trees and ignore emissions cuts, which are so vital. But secondly, restoration is far from easy, and it is not just about planting trees. This idea is so tempting, but it encourages people to invest in mass plantations of fast-growing trees that are better for, maybe good for rapid carbon offsets. But those plantations are often comprised of a single species that lack the thousands of interacting species of plants, animals, and microorganisms that are necessary to maintain clean air, clean water, and soil fertility for local people. It's estimated that almost half of restored projects around the world are massive monocultures like this. Now, many can be important for sustainable timber production, and when managed well, they can contribute to economic sustainability. But when planted just for carbon offsetting, they can often lead to the degradation of forests, grasslands, and other wetlands that are equally important for life on Earth. Restoration is not just about trapping carbon. Even if climate change stopped right now, the protection and revitalization of Earth's nature would be a top priority because it underpins all life on Earth and protects us against all other global threats. That's why a recent Pew poll suggested that 9 out of 10 Americans do support the idea of a trillion tree movement. But this idea is not just about planting 1 trillion trees. The trillion tree idea is about creating the conditions, the economic and the ecological conditions, where ecosystems can be protected and 1 trillion trees can regrow, either naturally or with human assistance, for the benefit of local communities everywhere. And that is the single most important key to successful restoration. Restoration cannot come at the expense of local people's land use. In fact, it works only when we find the innovations that make biodiversity an economically viable option for local people. That is what the coffee farm in Ethiopia had figured out. And there's examples of this in every region across the world, ranging from sustainable harvesting of timber, to the protection of forests to improve soil fertility, to the sale of carbon credits from naturally regenerating forests. The restoration of nature is not inherently a global challenge. It's a local one for the local biodiversity and the people that depend on it. And as the network of collective action grows, it benefits all of us.
Thank you, Dr. Crowther. Now we have Ms. Cover.
Good morning, Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Barrasso, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to submit testimony to you today about the role of innovative wood products in carbon storage. My name is Jennifer Cover, and I serve as the president and CEO of WoodWorks. WoodWorks is a nonprofit program staffed with engineers and architects committed to a more sustainable built environment. We help our peers gain the technical design skills needed to successfully build wood structures that are up to 18 stories. Last year alone, we directly supported 400 building projects that resulted in an impact of over 1 billion board feet of incremental wood product demand. The use of wood products from sustainably managed forests, particularly mass timber products like cross-laminated timber or CLT, is an incredible proactive climate mitigation tool. As a tree grows, it absorbs carbon dioxide from the air like a huge sponge and locks it away in its cellular structure. When that tree is harvested and converted into a wood building product, that carbon remains stored in the wood fiber. Wood is about 50% carbon by dry weight. I'm sure everyone here has picked up a 2x4 for a home project. Think about that weight. Almost half is carbon that was pulled from our atmosphere and physically stored in the wood. When wood is used to construct buildings, those buildings become giant carbon sinks. while a new tree is replanted, beginning the cycle of carbon sequestration again. The building industry is responsible for 40% of the global carbon dioxide emissions, with 11% of that coming from embodied carbon of the building materials. With mass timber, Wood Solutions can now play a sizable role in alleviating U.S. carbon emissions. Not only does wood sequester and store carbon, but the manufacturing process to produce wood products uses far less fossil fuel-based energy than other building materials, and it's 100% renewable. Mass timber, such as CLT, are large structural panel products. A typical panel might be 30 feet long, constructed from built-up pieces of smaller lumber or veneers. They're revolutionary because their strength allows them to be used as the main structural material in high-rise apartments, offices, schools, and warehouses. Building codes have evolved to recognize these capabilities. The most current code provides guidance on how to safely build mass timber buildings up to 18 stories. These tall wood code provisions have already been adopted by several jurisdictions, including Oregon, Washington, Utah, Idaho, California, and Denver, Colorado, and many others are in the process of adoption. Builders are choosing mass timber to improve the carbon footprint of their projects. One example is a 5-story office in Denver. The engineer wanted to understand the impact of using mass timber, so they undertook a comparative life cycle assessment of the same building designed in wood as well as more traditional materials. All 3 of the designs had a very similar cost impact, but the carbon footprint of the wood building was less than 1/3 of the other 2. The overall potential carbon impact of having chosen to go with CLT was equivalent to taking 630 cars off the road for an entire year. And that is just one building. There are 17,000 buildings built in this country every year that could by code be built with Wood Solutions, but they currently are not. Mass timber is good for the environment and good for rural communities. Increased demand for these products will create high-quality jobs in these communities. There are 6 mass timber plants producing building grade material operating in the U.S. so far, with 3 more about to start up. There are about 1,000 mass timber projects in the U.S. that are either built or in design. The momentum is clearly there, but we're still at the beginning of this building revolution, and support is needed from government leadership. Here in the U.S., we've been playing catch up with the rest of the world on the concept of embodied carbon. Europe and the United Kingdom have a number of policies focused on reducing embodied carbon in buildings. That's why it's really exciting to see the interest on this topic from leaders like yourselves. WoodWorks is a small program, and having the support of the Softwood Lumber Board and Agricultural Checkoff Program and the U.S. Forest Service is critical to our success. Under Chief Christensen's leadership, the Forest Service has been a strong supporter of the WoodWorks program. Supporting mass timber means supporting an innovative building solution that turns our cities into carbon sinks and brings increased and improved jobs to rural communities. Thank you again for supporting innovation and job creation in the forest and construction sectors. I hope you'll consider encouraging government entities in your states to utilize mass timber for their buildings. And if they need help, WoodWorks is available to provide that support. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Covert. Now we have Mr. Woodkey. You're on mute, Mr. Woodkey. We cannot hear you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Barrasso. My name is Ben Woodkey, and I'm the Executive Director of the Intermountain Forest Association. Our members are primarily forest products companies, many of which are multi-generational family businesses who rely heavily on national forest lands in Colorado, Wyoming, South Dakota, and Nebraska to meet their timber needs. I appreciate the opportunity to provide testimony on this important topic today. Our national forests are not currently meeting their full potential to sequester and store carbon. Large-scale mortality caused by insect epidemics and catastrophic wildfires are producing carbon emissions while limiting further carbon sequestration. Forest management is necessary on our national forests and must be both proactive and reactive, implementing forest management actions to reduce wildfire hazards and risk of insect epidemics before they occur, and also aiding recovery from similar disturbances. Proactive management on national forest lands that are not otherwise withdrawn from timber harvest is vital to the health of our forests and watersheds, to the protection of communities, in meeting societal needs for forest products, and reducing the likelihood of future carbon emissions. The need for active management on the millions of acres of national forests at risk to wildfire and disease has been acknowledged by successive Forest Service chiefs, committee chairs, secretaries of agriculture, and presidents for over 20 years. Although the hazardous fuels reduction account at the Forest Service has been steadily increasing, there is some good work being accomplished through those funds, the Forest Service is only able to treat a fraction of the acres needed to effectively reduce fire danger and ensure long-term forest health. Reforestation on our national forests is essential to their long-term sustainability. It is critically important for the committee to understand that deforestation by wildfire is the leading cause of the growing reforestation backlog on the national forests. The unprecedented 2020 fire season exacerbated the reforestation needs on our national forests. Conservation groups such as American Forests and the Nature Conservancy estimate that national forests have over 7 million acres requiring reforestation. Successfully reforesting these acres could sequester an additional 9 million tons of carbon from the atmosphere each year. But time is of the essence for reforestation efforts. Research is increasingly finding that burned forests are regenerating to non-forest ecotypes. If forested lands are type converted, reestablishing green and growing forests becomes exponentially more difficult to accomplish due to competition among seedlings and other vegetation and a significant hazard for reburns. Prompt timber salvage can improve reforestation success and should be part of an overall reforestation and restoration strategy whenever possible. Increasing the use of salvage as a tool can also help generate revenues for reforestation efforts. As the committee knows, trees are natural carbon sinks. They remove CO2 from the atmosphere and store it in wood fiber and roots. Young trees remove carbon quickly, and large trees can store considerable amounts of carbon. Unfortunately, as each fire season illustrates, forests do not store carbon indefinitely. Looking only at California, the wildfires in 2020 released an estimated 110 million metric tons of carbon into the atmosphere, the carbon equivalent of more than 24 million cars. Wood products also store carbon, and they can do so for long periods of time. By putting wood products into service, the carbon is effectively locked up for the duration that product is in use. Advanced wood products such as CLT and glulam can also have a solid carbon return on investment because they can substitute for high carbon intensity materials such as concrete and steel and should complement traditional forest products that are already successful in sequestering carbon. Much of the work that I'm discussing and others are discussing today isn't possible without forest products companies. In parts of the U.S., the Forest Service is using longer-term contracts and other mechanisms to entice new companies to areas where previous forest companies have been forced to close. Throughout Region 2 and other regions of the Forest Service, forest products companies depend on the Forest Service to sell timber, just as the Forest Service depends on those companies to perform the prescribed work. In the Black Hills, the forest industry has been operating sawmills for over a century, historically at much higher volumes of timber sold, and has been a critical part of the care and management of the national forest. Forest products companies in the Black Hills rely on the Forest Service for approximately 80% of their timber, and although we are fortunate to still have some of those companies remaining, their future is at risk. Currently, there is a tremendous demand for forest products, and the markets are reflecting that. Companies that operate on national forest lands can help the Forest Service treat more acres and also bring needed lumber to consumers. I thank you for the opportunity to speak today regarding the health and resilience of our national forests and the role they should play in sequestering carbon. Our national forests deliver numerous goods and services, and efforts to improve carbon sequestration and storage on national forests should focus on sequestering more carbon through active management and storing carbon in wood products. As the nation confronts the need to sequester more carbon while producing needed lumber to meet our needs, the national forests can continue to meet these diverse requirements if we craft policies carefully and realistically. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we have Mr. Irving.
Thank you, Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Barrasso, and other committee members for the opportunity to testify on the role of forests in the fight against climate change here today. Myself, along with my brother Robert, we're co-CEOs of JD Irving Limited. We're stationed in New Brunswick, Canada, and we're a diverse family-owned business. And one of our key parts of our business is the forest products business. The value chain we have today goes from the tree seed to the consumer shelf. We have in our business, our forest products business, we have a seed orchard, two nurseries, 10 sawmills, a pulp mill, 2 paper mills, and 4 tissue mills, plus 5.9 million acres of timberland under management. On our own that we own in Canada, fee land is roughly 1.9 million acres. That we own in Maine is roughly 1.3 million acres, and we manage for the province of New Brunswick approximately 2.6 million acres. We're the second largest private landowner in North America and the largest private landowner in Maine, state of Maine. The forests are a foundation of our value chain for our forest products business. We have a healthy, vigorous forest as a result of a growing wood supply. Since 1957, we've planted over 1 billion trees, and that's a record for a Canadian company, for a private Canadian company. And our forest products business is based on the following philosophy: do what's right in the forest to ensure it remains healthy, vigorous, and growing. Look after our people and our communities, look after the environment and ecosystems, and run efficient operations and treat the resource with respect. Our philosophy is to continuously add value to all of our products that our forest provides. As a result, our long-term commitment to forest management, our current planted stands will grow 4 times the volume, more volume, and sequester 4 times more carbon than a forest regenerates naturally over the life of approximately 50 years, which is can be the cycle here in the Northeast. Because we maintain a healthy, vigorous forest through stand tending and with treatments like thinning, we have lower occurrences of fire and pest outbreaks than the national averages in Canada and the US. Loss to pests, for example, is 0.001%, and loss to fire is 0.004%. Our forest and forest products operate at a net carbon sink, absorbing the equivalent of approximately 350,000 cars per year. Trees provide different products, and some of those are of higher value and some are lower value. And forest products different mixes of products depending on their age and treatment. But to us, a healthy forest is a working forest. Removal of mortality and fuels, less risk to fires and pests, and higher carbon sequestration rates and lower carbon emissions are the result. In addition, to make sure that happens, we invest in forest protection against fires and pests. We own 4 fixed-wing aircraft, 2 helicopters, 37 fire trucks, and 7 privately owned and outfitted airstrips to make sure we can combat the problem of fire and pests. That type of forest management requires markets sometimes for lower grade products like pulpwood and biomass that are generated from the tending operations. And we have to put the capital in to make sure that happens. However, the forest products industry in North America has been in some segments declining for a number of years for some of those products that are used at the low grade value wood. And landowners to make these kinds of investments require stability of markets and in policy to make sure that long-term investments in silviculture like tree planting and thinning are able to be carried out. Forest management, good forest management, is depending on a healthy industry and vice versa. It's a virtuous cycle, good for jobs and the economy, people and the communities, carbon sequestration and conservation. And we need policymakers should ensure that landowners are incentivized to make long-term investments like tree planting and thinning. Policymakers should ensure that the industry is balanced, that the output of the forest is healthy, and investing in production capacity, as well as research on new products like cross-laminated timber. It's difficult today to make sure we have the right amount of research. And this is quite important that it's properly funded, and both at the universities and by industry. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you today.
Thank you, Mr. Irving. And now we'll start our questions. Mr. Woodkey, I would like to ask you about salvage logging, where land managers try to recover the economic value of dead trees through fires and other types of things before they rot to a point where they lose their economic value. Different groups clearly have different views on this practice as people debate where this might be appropriate and where it isn't appropriate. Lawsuits are often filed, and as decisions being sorted out, the trees rot to a point where they have no value whatsoever. So I believe everyone should be entitled to voicing their opinion, but I can't help but wonder if these discussions would be more productive if they took place in advance of the trees dying. So my question would be, do you believe that it would be possible for land management agencies like the BLM and the Forest Service to solicit public input, to make the necessary decisions ahead of a devastating wildfire or an insect outbreak so they cannot have the time constraints they face now and lose that value of the product.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, as you said, there's different viewpoints, and of course, salvage logging should be undertaken on a case-by-case basis. It makes sense in many areas. It certainly makes sense following a lot of disturbances. It's not a one-size-fits-all tool. But you hit on a key point there, and that's that salvage logging, when you're salvaging trees that are already dead, your time is limited. And oftentimes we see where agencies get hamstrung by a lengthy environmental analysis process that they are not able to actually salvage that material in time.
Do you know if there's any practice whatsoever evaluating beforehand, knowing we're going to have fires, we're going to have insect plagues, we're going to have all this? Is anybody doing this in advance, or they wait until after it happens and then try to catch up, and by then it's too late?
There are a few examples where they're trying to do it in advance, but by and large, it's reactive. Folks are doing the analysis, agencies are doing the analysis after a disturbance, after a wildfire, after mountain pine beetle mortality, after a hurricane. And I do believe that there are opportunities to do that in advance, either through forest plan amendments or having large landscape scale projects already NEPA cleared when they know what they need to do following a disturbance that they've seen before.
Thank you, Mr. Woodkey. Mr. Irving, in your testimony, you talked about how J.D. Irving thins approximately 10,600 acres annually of its 3.3 million acres of private timberland. When I compare that to the information that Mr. Woodkey provided, it appears that the percentage of your land that you thin every year is 5 times more than the percentage that the U.S. Forest Service thins annually. We also heard from Ms. Mitsos that the U.S. Forest Service spends around $1,000 per acre on its thinning projects. So is the primary reason that you have such low mortality rates from insects and wildfires due to the amount of thinning that your company does each year? And how does the cost compare to the Forest Service?
Well, sir, I can't compare. I don't have the right evidence to compare against the Forest Service. I'm not familiar with those operations. All I can tell you about our operations. I would say there's no question about it, though. Thinning is paramount for a couple of things. One is you have to get rid of the low value trees if you're going to let the higher value trees grow. That's fundamental. We have 2 types of thinning, what we call pre-commercial thinning, where we have approximately 10,000 stems the acre of a natural forest, and we'll thin that back down to about 700 trees per acre. And that will cost us anywhere between $250 and $400 an acre at the average age of 15 years of age, and the wages per man is about $20 an hour.
Why is it so much?
Then we have commercial thinning.
Why is that so much
Excuse me,
more
sir.
cost? I'm sorry, sir. It's so much more cost effective. It's costing the forest management $1,000, U.S. Forest Service, $1,000 per acre, and I don't think they're doing what you're doing. Is it just government?
Sir, well, I'm not going to criticize the government, Senator Manchin, but I tell you, I don't know the local conditions, but I can tell you our conditions, and you know, it's the Northeast, it's Maine, particularly if you want to take Maine as an example. Those are the facts that we have, and I'm not sure the reason why that. But I can tell you, it's like any other business. You have to pay careful attention to your costs and work very hard at it to make sure we're automated and very efficient. In our commercial thinning, where we do 10,000, which is where we try and take the very small commercial trees out of the forest, we'll go from about 900 trees, which is the second step after we've done the pre-commercial thinning. We'll go from 900 trees to 350 trees per acre, approximate numbers, at an age of 20 to 25. And that cost is a premium over our normal logging cost of about $150 per acre. And the operator doing that work would be paid $25 to $30 an hour. That's automated Scandinavian type of machinery, logging equipment, highly productive. We work day and night, all the technology, the computers and the machine to make sure nobody does anything environmentally incorrect. And then we retooled our mills to make sure that we can handle all this small wood, because it's, as you know, very small pieces have to be processed very, very quickly and efficiently. So there's a range of things that happen, but there's no question about it. Technology and an attitude about you have to treat the forest when it's time to treat it. There's no point in thinning the forest when it's too old, because you waste your money. It's inefficient. Thin it at the right time, you can do it efficiently, and you can do the best thing environmentally for the forest and for the commercial side of this as well.
Thank you, sir, very much. Senator Barrasso.
Well, thanks so much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the testimony from all of you. Mr. Woodkey, and also Ms. Mitsos, a question for both of you. Let me first ask Mr. Woodkey, I'd like to hear more about some of the benefits of mechanical tree thinning, timber harvesting, other hazardous fuel reduction treatments, because in your view, is the U.S. Forest Service carrying out enough of these projects in order to reduce wildfire risk and increase the health of our forests?
Thank you, Senator. Where the Forest Service is carrying out treatments, they're being proven to be highly effective. As a federal agency, they are bottlenecked by certain issues. One is certainly staffing and funding. Others are finding efficiencies to help them accomplish more with what they have. And I think there's some options that have recently gone through rulemaking processes. We've seen a lot of legislation being introduced the last few years that I think would help the agency out. But really, when you perform these fuel reduction activities, you are taking carbon off the landscape, you are locking that into forest products most often, and you are preventing high severity fires that would come through and kill those trees and release that carbon on the landscape in the future. Those efforts are resoundingly effective. And in places where there isn't enough happening, we're seeing the evidence. As was mentioned earlier, numerous Western states are now carbon sources. Their forests are carbon sources and not carbon sinks anymore. And when you think about the scale, the scope that must be occurring on the landscape, it tells you a lot about the health of our forests and the need that we must be doing more on the landscape.
So for you and then for Ms. Mitsos, does it make sense to target or incentivize mechanical tree thinning, timber harvesting, and other hazardous fuel reduction treatments in areas that we really know are high risk of catastrophic wildfires?
Absolutely, whether it's incentivizing or prioritizing, I think there are a lot of different ways, and again, it would vary by where you're talking about doing those treatments, but we have to be doing something different than we've been doing the last 20 years. We have to be looking at landscape scale treatments. We have to be thinking about the forest as a whole and not just isolated slices around communities, because while that may do a lot to protect homes, it doesn't do a lot to protect atmospheric carbon sources or wildlife or water resources or the forest itself.
Thank you. Ms. Mitsos?
Yes, it does make sense to target those treatments in high priority areas, and the Forest Service is now on a path to do a national map for those priority areas.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Woodkey again, as well as Mr. Irving, for both of you, from a carbon storage perspective, does it make sense to focus active management activities in older tree stands that already have diminished or no ability to sequester additional carbon and in areas with hazardous levels of fuel?
Thank you, Senator. I can start with that. And, really it makes sense to target and prioritize our efforts where they're going to have the most impact, whether that's old stands or moderate age stands. That certainly has to be analyzed on a case-by-case, but again, it's where you have the most impact to prevent future carbon emissions. But I will say that there's kind of a belief out there that when you cut into a tree, it somehow deflates like a balloon and the carbon is released. And there's a lot of pushback on harvesting older trees because they store a lot of carbon. But they continue to store that carbon when you put it into forest products as well. And that's something that has to really be recognized, is that if you cut a larger tree or older tree, you're not emitting that carbon into the atmosphere in the same way that you would when it dies naturally or from insects or disease or from wildfire. You're effectively locking that carbon up into products.
Mr. Irving?
So, Senator, thank you, Senator. I think there's a couple of things. One is trees are like people. They get to a certain age and they die eventually. So depending on the species and where they're located. So you want to harvest the tree at the right age. Notwithstanding, I know in the Northwest there's some very grand stands of trees, very old trees, and that's a different. In my world, that's a different species, much something to be greatly respected. But in our part of the world, we know the rotation time somewhere around 50 years or so, and then we'll have a transition to a new generation of trees. So the job is cut those trees, harvest those trees at the right time, then replant them right away with the same genetics, same species of tree, but an improved tree. So we'll improve the carbon absorption. So we can do both. We can take the tree at the right time, the most economical age, and replant it so we have no disruption. And we don't let any wood die or rot to create fuel that will emit carbon or fires so it's like anything else. But you're raising a subject about how do we keep management. That forestry is a long-term business, very long-term. The rotation time in Brazil is 6 years. If you're in the Pacific Northwest, maybe it's 80 years. In the southeastern United States, it's maybe 25 years. In the Northeast, it's about 40 to 50 years. So somebody has to be able to say, the Forest Service, I would say, and I don't know all the details of the Forest Service, but if they're going to encourage the operators to make the investment in equipment, in management, in technology, they have to know that I have tenure, I can go out and I can do a good job, and I can amortize my cost over a certain period of time, and hold me accountable. We call it outcome-based forestry here in the Northeast, where we work with the government in the state of Maine. What are the objectives? What are we trying to do? What would they like to accomplish? And then let us go do it. Come and audit us, manage us, check on us, and we have to be held to account for performance, or you don't. But we have flexibility, which is very important in terms of keeping the cost and being competitive and getting the outcomes everybody wants. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Heinrich.
Thank you, Chairman. And I think it would have helped to actually have a Forest Service witness here, because that seems to be a perspective that we're missing that might have some of the answers to some of these issues. And in particular, one of the things that's occurred to me is that there's a big difference in cost. We see a wide range of treatments between the sort of private land treatments that
We reached out to him, Senator Heinrich, and they said it would take weeks in advance for them to be prepared.
That's absurd.
That's absurd.
Yeah.
That's why.
Because there's a big difference in treating an acre of relatively flat, deciduous forest in a place like Maine or eastern Canada versus the cost of treating a steep mixed conifer forest on a 40% grade. Oh, yeah. No, I mean, it's all relative, Angus. It's real, 40% grade on the side of the Rocky Mountains in a very remote area. And so that's part of the reasons why we see these giant differences in the cost to treat an acre. And I guess the lesson there is just like a forest isn't a forest. The local conditions really drive many of these differences, and I think we need to get to that. One of the challenges I have in New Mexico, and this question is really for any of our witnesses who want to chime in on it, is that most of the trees that we need to remove in treatments from our forests are not trees that are easily sent to market. They're small diameter ladder fuels that currently don't lend themselves to traditional forest products. And I guess I'd like to ask folks what progress is being made in finding ways to turn those small diameter trees into value-added products so that right now it costs a lot to treat those acres, and then hopefully if we had those products, that cost could be mitigated or at least reduced. Ms. Mitzos, did you? Oh, no. Go ahead, sir, and then I think Ms. Mitzos wants to answer that.
Mr. Irving, go ahead.
Okay, no, I just say in terms of processing the small trees, you raise a good point that you have to be very efficient. We've spent millions of dollars in our own sawmills processing trees. Sometimes we'll take out just one piece of 2x3 or one piece of 2x4 that, and we'll supply this to the Home Depot, for example. But we have a mindset. We say it's just like the butcher. We got to sell everything in the pig, including the squeal. So we've got to make sure we save everything and really be efficient. And so, but it takes capital to do that. But it can be done, at least in our part of the world.
And I guess the challenge we have is many of the trees we need to remove they're not big enough for dimensional lumber. So what do we do with those? And Ms. Mitsos, you looked like you wanted to answer that.
I think there's a number of options. Some still need more investment, but biochar is one option. Biomass is another. There's promising signs with CLT about the size that they can use. We're doing some work in Arizona on Bill Williams Mountain where the small timber that's coming off is given to wood for fuel to the Hopi
Right.
and Navajo
Yep.
nations.
So you mentioned biochar. Talk to me more about that. It's a product that has enormous potential, but it's been difficult to find ways to scale that in these landscapes, especially in landscapes where there are vast distances, and much of what determines whether something is pencils at the end of the day is the distance to market and the fuel cost for a product like biochar.
Yes, well, there's some folks up in Montana who have mobile portable facilities that are proving to be really useful. And oftentimes the biochar is immediately put back into the soil, which also helps the soil retain more carbon as well.
That's very helpful. Mr. Woodkey, I had one more question for you before my time is out. Talk to me about the role of prescribed fire in the active management of Western North American forests, particularly those that are evolved for regular fire cycles, such as ponderosa pine.
Thank you, Senator. Prescribed fire plays a critical role in forest management. It should be implemented on more acres. I think federal agencies should be looking at prescribed fire as a tool in a lot of places. The one caveat to that is that just in the sense that our forests are burning unnaturally during wildfire season, those same unnatural conditions make it very difficult to implement prescribed fire safely and to meet the objectives of those burn plans in a lot of areas. And so it's a little bit of a chicken and the egg. You need to really first go in and create forest conditions that are conducive to promoting prescribed fire use. Oftentimes looking at historic forest conditions and tree spacing and making sure that the fuel is removed from the area before putting that needed fire back on the landscape. And fire can certainly be used as a maintenance tool once those conditions are in place. But it's very difficult to just go in and use prescribed fire as the first step in any kind of treatment plan.
Thank you, Chairman. And that's exactly what we found in many of these places where it may cost $1,000 an acre to treat something. To maintain it with prescribed fire is dramatically cheaper. And so creating those conditions for healthy maintenance really set the stage for decades into the future.
Thank you, Senator. Next we have, if he's done, Senator Lee and WebEx, if he's there. If not, we had then Senator Marshall, and I think he's coming back probably. And then if we'll go to Senator Daines, and I think he had to step out, and we'll go down to Senator Cassidy. Senator Cassidy, Senator Daines. Is there any Republican that we know on WebEx? Senator King.
I could make a lot of jokes now, Mr. Chairman, but I
No, it'd be best if you don't.
best not, yes. I also want to mention that I think we need the Forest Service on this subject. And here's what I want from the Forest Service. I want three things: data, data, and data. And I want comparison of fire rates on Forest Service land versus privately managed land. I want output per acre. I want to know the kinds of comparisons. I want expense per acre, because I have a sense, and I'm perfectly willing and hopefully will be proved wrong, that we basically don't manage our lands anywhere near adequately, and it's one of the things that contributes to wildfires. If you don't clear out, if you don't do the pre-commercial thinning that Mr. Irving was mentioning, you're building up a base for wildfires. If you leave a lot of forest products on the floor of the forest, you're going to aggravate the forest fire problem. Plus, we're not getting the value from our forests that the public owns, as we should. So I hope that we can either do questions for the record or inquiry from the committee to the Forest Service, but I think we really need, I feel the need of data to compare public land ownership with private land ownership in terms of productivity, fires, and all the rest. Mr. Irving, I'm fascinated by your comments about output-based forestry, which I think makes a lot of sense rather than prescriptive forest regulation. The problem that I see is, how do you know the output-based is working without a lot of time passing? In other words, if you are assuming that you're going to measure the output over a period of years, there could be a lot of damage done, not by your company, but by another operator, that then the damage is done. Do you see what I'm saying? Output-based regulation, to me, is the way to go, but the measurement has to be in such a way that you can be sure that it is, in fact, reaching the outputs that are desired by both the public and the private sector.
Well, Senator, there's a couple of things on that, and you raised the right points. In the case of Maine, and I know you're very familiar with this, we do an annual audit with state employees. They're independent experts who come in and look at our operations. And that's fine. That's sort of a visual, and they check the numbers. Then every 5 years, we will do a very prescriptive, okay, hard line measurements. Did we do what we say we're going to do? And then today with technology, LiDAR, for example, we can detect, we get satellite imagery. We get every 2 weeks, we'll have pictures of our forest if we want. And somebody can compare this year versus last year or whatever you want to compare. So today with technology, there's no reason why we should have any mystery about, did we say what we're going to do? Because right today, we can count every tree with LiDAR. It's that precise.
I appreciate that. I think that's an important point, that we have the technology today to measure on an ongoing basis. So output-based regulation as opposed to prescriptive regulation can work. Let me follow up another question involving your company and your management. You're a family-owned company. You don't have to report quarterly profits to Wall Street. Talk to me about the structure of ownership that could affect the type of forestry that you're doing. You're obviously doing a lot of things right. You're making a lot of investments. You're looking at a 40-year time horizon. My concern is that the sort of structure of the capital markets in terms of public ownership, of stock ownership, and having to report to Wall Street pushes toward shorter-term profits, higher harvests, less long-term investments. Talk to me about the difference between family ownership and quarterly profit reports.
Sure. And you summed it up right. If we were a public company, we'd have probably a very hard time explaining to the shareholders what we're doing, some of these things, taking this long time horizon. But there's a couple of things that might ease that problem a little bit. When it comes to tree planting, for example, we advocate, we think, and I know it's not the purview of this committee, but things being able to expense your tree planting. In Canada, we can expense our tree planting in the year we take it. So it's a form of, it's depreciation, if you will. You take it up front. So we diminish the cost this year. But there's no question about it. It's a long-term business. It's well suited, better suited to private enterprise. And so the transition from one generation to another in terms of inheritance or rollover or whatever you want to call it is very important, because continuity, if you're in Brazil, you grow the trees in 6 years. If you have a potato field, you know the crop in 120 days. But in the Northeast, it's 40 years. So you have to have a different mindset. And it's tough for the public companies or some of the timber REITs, very high hurdle rates, to accomplish what you've described.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, could I follow up on one
Please
question?
go right ahead.
On a different subject. Ms. Cover, I'm very interested in CLT. I think it's a natural. It makes so much, it's a natural. That's kind of a redundancy, isn't it? But what are the obstacles? Is it building codes? Is it architects' reluctance? Is it just unfamiliarity with the technology? How do we really stimulate the growth of CLT usage across America. And I know, ironically, in Europe, where they have much less forests than we do, they're ahead of us in the utilization. What's the barrier to the expansion of the use of engineered wood products for major building projects?
That's a great question, Senator. Thank you. Yeah, and you hit the nail right on the head in terms of the main hurdle is education and understanding. It is really helping the architectural and engineering community understand how to design these projects, and also understanding the value of working forests. I think helping folks understand what we are all discussing here today, that strong markets for wood products, particularly underutilized species and materials. There's a lot of research being done even in materials that have insect damage that can go into CLT. So this is an opportunity for some of these materials that we're talking about that are creating hazardous fuels. And the hurdle is really understanding that and helping architects and engineers have the tool to design with it.
Well, it seems to me one thing would be examples of buildings. The Portland Jetport has a beautiful CLT ceiling that is a manifestation of how this can work. And maybe we need to talk about public buildings. We have a chance. I'm sure the federal government builds thousands of buildings across the United States on a 5-year basis. We need to show people how this can work, including architects and building inspectors. Thank you very much. Thanks to all of our
Senator
witnesses.
King. Senator Lee?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Crowther, Mr. Woodkeep mentioned in his testimony that 98 million acres of our national forests, 98 million acres, that is representing more than half of the total acreage, are in restrictive land use designations, including wilderness or inventoried roadless areas. These restrictions in these areas can make access really difficult for forest treatments to be conducted. In wilderness, even if access could be achieved, mechanized tools used to harvest timber are generally prohibited. But Dr. Crowther, if addressing climate change and mitigating wildfires are to be among our nation's top priorities in this area, do you think Congress should reevaluate the laws prohibiting timber harvest in these areas? And can you explain a little bit about that?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. I think wherever possible, timber harvest needs to be a part of the process to be considered. Wherever it is physically possible, I think finding economic values from nature is going to be a central part of the process. And as everybody has just discussed, the greater that we can find the benefits from non-target species, and the more investment we can have in those technologies that can improve the utilization of those species, the better. The thinning of species is incredibly valuable in natural forests as well. It can promote the regeneration of nature. It can promote the carbon sequestration rates and the long-term sequestration of that carbon as well. It was mentioned earlier about biochar being a spectacular opportunity, obviously limited by the availability or by the accessibility of those products. But again, these sort of lower quality timber products can be so valuable for biochar that then also has a knock-on potential benefit on agricultural settings where you can massively improve carbon sequestration in soil. So
Right.
Sorry.
No, I'm just agreeing with you. Sounds like a win to me.
I think the other benefit it comes with the access to tourists. Tourism is a huge benefit that comes from nature, that comes from forests, that comes from regenerating and protecting ecosystems. And so access to that has potential benefits. Obviously, it also has potential downsides, as poor management or deforestation rates can obviously be associated with increased access. So as an ecologist, my own personal motivation is always try and keep as much nature as physically possible. But as I mentioned, the key to any successful activity is those economic incentives. So
yeah, no, I think that's very well said. And the point of wilderness, of course, is to keep untrammeled land untrammeled. But they're from time to time, in order to protect the environment and maintain wilderness in a pristine condition, sometimes access needs to be granted for reasons related to protecting the environment. Mr. Woodkey, there are a number of constituents in my state who would love to be able to harvest timber, but who have been reluctant to do so because of administrative or, in some cases, structural obstacles. For example, while Forest Service stewardship contracts for timber harvesting can extend for periods that are up to 10 years, timber sale and service contracts are commonly offered for much shorter periods of time, more typically in the range of 3 years. With shorter work commitments, we tend to see decreased certainty for industry partners, and installing the infrastructure to facilitate work may not be worth the cost under a 3-year commitment. So, Mr. Woodkey, in your opinion, what can Congress or federal agencies do in order to increase business certainty and thereby foster greater interest in these programs?
Thank you, Senator. Utilizing stewardship contracts and particularly longer-term stewardship contracts and longer-term contracting mechanisms, it's something that should be looked at and is trying to be utilized in parts of the U.S., particularly in areas where you're trying to entice forest products companies into the area. You give them something that they can invest in, or you're trying to bolster your current forest products infrastructure that you have there to meet other objectives. In other parts of the country, you already have forest products companies. Some places they're very well cross-integrated, where some companies use saw timber, some companies use post and pole size material, other companies use wood chips. And in those areas, really what the companies need to invest is some certainty that the Forest Service or Department of Interior is going to be putting up the timber to sustain their company year after year. When you already have forest products industry there, you don't need a 20-year contract. And in some places that can favor certain companies over others when you already have infrastructure in place. But I think you're right on with the companies need some level of certainty that they're going to have timber this year and next year and 10 years from now, because investments into forest products infrastructure are on the order of tens to hundreds of millions of dollars, not small scale.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Mr. Chairman, I see my time's expired. Thank you.
And now we have Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To the panelists, great conversation. Let me talk a little bit about invasive species. I would love your impact here. Controlling invasive non-native species in our forest systems represents another key component for enhancing carbon capture. So my question to the panelists are, how can we best work with local landowners to reverse the negative effects that we see of invasive species and preserve our forest ecosystem? And maybe Mr. Woodkey, we can start with you.
Thank you. Certainly private landowners have their own incentives to reduce invasive species. If you're talking about forest lands, oftentimes a private landowner may have intents to utilize grazing in the understory on the herbaceous vegetation, oftentimes looking at long-term timber harvest schedules. Private landowners have a lot of incentive to reduce invasive species. Invasive species is certainly playing a larger role in the landscape for all ownerships, as we're seeing increased acres of wildfires. We're even seeing invasive species issues following other disturbances such as insect epidemics. How we coordinate more with landowners, kind of across the fence with federal and private, I'm not sure I have the answer on that, but I think that it warrants a lot further discussion.
Thank you. Mr. Irving or anyone else have any input on this? So let me give you an example, because we have a lot of rangeland fires in Nevada, and cheatgrass is an invasive species, and it is unfortunately something that needs to be controlled. And so there is a role, I think, for the federal government and our local landowners to work together to address the types of invasive species now we see in forests or rangeland, wherever that is. I think it is important that we have native trees, we have native plants, those thrive, they're unique to the ecosystem there, and important for that ecosystem. When we introduce a native species, we are seeing really negative consequences of that. So I am curious what we at a federal level should be doing to work with with our local landowners or others to address invasive species. Does anybody have any other comments?
Senator, we would, it's Jim Irving, we would say, look, we've got to be very vigilant. As a landowner, you have to be on top of it. Our people in our organization are trained what to look for and deal with it quickly and early. We have things like blue lettuce or jewelweed or other things that didn't have 10 or 15 years ago. So, and in certain cases where we have certain very carefully applied biocide to treat it and then eradicate it quickly. But if we don't, they're very aggressive species, as you know, aware. They're very aggressive, and they change the balance of the biodiversity, not only for the forest, but also for the wildlife. And so we've got to be on that one quickly.
Well, absolutely. And because you're a private landowner, you have the ability to be very reactive and proactive on it quickly. But when it comes to our national forests, is there more that we should be doing to address invasive species is my question. And if anybody has an answer to that, would be happy to work with you on that in the future. But let me jump, because I only have so much time. Mr. Woodkey, let me ask you this. Throughout the West and Southwest, research is increasingly describing burn scars as regenerating to brush fields. This makes reforestation a time-sensitive issue. If lands are lost to brush fields, reestablishing green and growing forest becomes exponentially more difficult to accomplish, as brush outcompetes young trees and poses a significant hazard for reburns. This was in your written statement. And so, as you know, wildfires are continuing to increase in frequency and size. What challenges does this pose for the ecosystem regeneration?
Thank you, Senator. The challenges are abundant, really. And, you know, there's a lot of research coming out of the Arizona, New Mexico area following wildfires. It's been coming out for years now, actually, where they're seeing long-term ecotype conversions from ponderosa pine forest, predominantly in that area, to grass and shrub type of ecotypes. And that's largely because of the ecology of ponderosa pine forests. They are fire-adapted species, fire-adapted forests, but they're adapted to low-severity fires, not the high-severity fires we're seeing as a product of the high fuel loads in the forest. And when the ponderosa pine loses their canopy, they can't disperse the seed very far. And so that's why you're seeing ecotype conversions there. But there's new research also in other forests, such as lodgepole pine, where they've experienced beetle mortality and then experienced fire following that. And although lodgepole pine forests in places have evolved with high severity fire, they're seeing some of the same effects that you would see in ponderosa pine systems, where that seed source is being consumed and you're not getting the regeneration following fire in those forested ecosystems. Of course, this presents tremendous challenges when you're really turning the natural ecology of a forested ecosystem on its head, and then once you get that grass, the other herbaceous vegetation on the surface there, that tends to outcompete young trees, young seedlings, whether it's natural regeneration or planting. All of that vegetation is competing for resources on the landscape and makes it very, very difficult to do replanting in the future. There are steps that can help that, but the difficulties are there nonetheless.
Thank you. I have further questions. I will submit those for the record. Thank you again.
Thank you, Senator. Now we have Senator Daines.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to welcome Mary Mistos from Missoula, who's here. Great to have another Montana in the room. Welcome to D.C. Mary, you know firsthand the challenges facing our forests in Montana. It's really great to have you here. Appreciate it. I also want to highlight that so many of the challenges we face in the West, both economic and environmental, can be achieved through increasing the scope and the scale of forest management. In fact, growing up in Montana, there were 30 active sawmills that were supporting healthy economies and healthy forests once upon a time. Today, we're down to just 7. During that time, our forests were a carbon sink. Now, and sadly to report, our forests are a carbon source. Wildfire season is growing longer and more severe, burning some 300,000 acres in Montana just last year. I'm hopeful that this year Congress will work to enact meaningful forest management reform to reverse this trend. The initial COVID-related disruptions and demand for lumber used in home construction and remodeling far exceeded the supply being produced by mills, causing prices to more than triple. In the South, there's been a glut of logs. coming from private lands, which kept log prices low while mills operate at full capacity. Due to federal land ownership, the situation played very differently in Montana. While the mills were generally able to continue operating throughout the year, lumber production decreased by 11%. And that's not for a lack of forests that are in dire need of management. In fact, over 6 million acres are at high risk of wildfire in Montana. And just last year, Montana's harvested timber from national forests was just over half of the allowable sale quantity volume called for in our forest plans. Our national forests are poised to help with the lumber shortage, and we must increase active management to address this crisis. Mr. Wuttke, despite being blessed with abundant forests, our country isn't meeting our domestic demand for wood products. What constraints does the timber industry face in its ability to invest in processing capacity, infrastructure, and technology in order to meet the growing demand for wood products from national forests in the West?
Thank you, Senator. I'll first say I doubt it's of any comfort, but you're not the only state that is now that have forests that are carbon sources instead of carbon sinks. But I doubt that's of any comfort to any of us here today. During this, as we're seeing markets respond to lumber demand and the supply issue of lumber, there's a lot of discussion and questions that I hear from folks about why doesn't a company increase what they're doing? Why don't they build another sawmill? Why can't we fix this problem? And it comes back to some of the discussion earlier in that, to start a new forest products company, whether it's a sawmill or a biofuels facility, we're talking about investments on the order of $125 million to hundreds of millions of dollars. And that's not an investment you make lightheartedly. And an investment like that really requires some sense that you're going to be able to get a return on it. And in the West, where purchasers and sawmills primarily rely on federal lands, it's very difficult to get that certainty. As you discussed, the allowable sale quantity in forest plans is seldom met. We see cycles where 1 year may be good for a forest and the next year may be bad, and it's very difficult to do any level of planning for a business to be successful when there's just no guarantee of getting the materials you need to be profitable to remain running year after year.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time engaged with our sawmills across Montana over many, many years, and the reason we've gone from 30 active sawmills down to 7, and we're now the constraint now is just not enough sawmill capacity, is because, just as you pointed out, we've been not been able to get access to logs. Sometimes we bring in logs as far away as Colorado, sometimes coming in from Canada. And that's why we've had to see these mills reduced down to now just 7 across our state. Wyoming has none. I don't think Colorado has any either. I want to shift gears here and talk about carbon storage. The Biden administration established a goal of reducing emissions by 50% by 2050. While forests should assist us towards that goal, Montana forests are actually a net positive carbon source, largely due to catastrophic wildfires and a decrease in wood products coming from our forests. In the 90s, when timber volume was much higher, Montana's forest sequestered 20 million tons of CO2 out of the air each year. But by 2010, we've reversed course. In fact, our forests in Montana now emit 25 million tons of CO2. Mr. Wuttke, what would need to happen to reverse this trend so Montana forests can once again operate as a carbon sink and should be a component in the president's climate agenda?
Thank you for the question, Senator. I think it's clear today that what we've been doing the last couple decades isn't working. The lack of forest management, the lack of reducing fuels and insect risk on the landscape is not helping us now. And to the extent that we're concerned about atmospheric carbon inputs and the role that forests can play, I don't think that anybody would call what's happened in our national forests a success. And to be clear, I think the answer is relatively simple. Big picture, of course, it'll vary place by place, but big picture, we have to be more active on the landscape. We have to be salvaging material where appropriate before it goes up in flames, before it decomposes on the landscape. We have to be proactive in reducing those risks for further losses to insects and wildfires. We have to be doing more on the landscape to have our forests become carbon sinks instead of sources again.
Thank you, Mr. Woodkey. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Now we have Senator Cantwell.
Thank you, Senator Manchin, and thank you to you and Senator Barrasso for holding this important hearing. I just wanted to clarify a couple of things. So I guess this would be to our witness from Ms. Cover. We did in the last big Lands and Fire bill fix incentives so that if you are doing CLT related projects and longer lead times, then you could get more predictable terms from the Forest Service. Is that correct?
So I'm on the market side of things. So I do the,
Okay.
I work with architects and engineers and help grow the markets for wood products. So I'm not familiar with the agreements with the Forest Service.
I'm pretty sure what we did in the last forest bill as it related to CLT is to say give more predictable terms to people who are going to harvest for CLT. So that way a mill could plan, just as our colleagues are discussing here, a mill could basically have more predictable terms for the future, longer term stewardship contracts, and thereby, participate. Now, this is important for us in the Pacific Northwest. We've already, made major investments in this. We have one of the largest CLT facilities in the United States, Katerra, which is producing nearly 1/3 of our mass timber, and Vaughan, which is also a longstanding timber company in Northeast Washington, is manufacturing CLT. Just recently, a Wood Innovation Center in Darrington, Washington, opened to also do manufacture CLT products. So anyway, I just want to make sure we get this clear for the record that the Forest Service can give longer-term contracts and more predictability to harvest related to CLT. This is one of the reasons why we wanted to do it, because we wanted to incent this predictability so people would make the infrastructure investments. And then secondly, while my colleagues from Oregon is huddling here, Oregon has, back to you, I'd say, Ms. Cover, Oregon has really done a pretty good job on this. On the planning and the development stage, the university there has some leading experts on CLT, and I don't know why it is, but Oregon has adopted some of these, some of this focus quicker.
We just work with Washington.
Yeah.
We get brilliant.
Well, I think we need to keep batting down some of the misconceptions about building as a material here. People think that it's more flammable when in reality it's not. I mean, that these buildings at a high-rise level are being built around the world, and I think they should be built in the United States. I think probably one of the largest ones, I don't know how many stories it is, but definitely 20 to 30 stories in Vancouver, British Columbia. There are others in London that have been at this height. So to me, we should be batting down these arguments. Now, in the Pacific Northwest, we've definitely built schools and buildings and facilities. So we do need to think about what we need to do. But, Mr. Chairman, I think actually we just need to marry up the science, because we have pine forests that are going to burn down, we know, because of climate, and we have fire breaks that we want because it's going to help us preserve some of those forests, and we have rural communities that could, with predictable contracting, produce more cross-laminated timber, which we know now would help us store carbon. So we always thought it was a win-win-win situation. So, Ms. Cover, what do you think, what do we need to be doing further to help get that message across? Is this, we're just not communicating well enough on this, or in places like Washington and Oregon it is happening and we should just continue to let it happen at that pace?
I think the leadership in terms of, forest-dependent communities really helps, and I think that's why you're seeing the advancements in areas like Oregon and Washington, but it's across the entire U.S. I mean, there is a CLT mass timber building pretty much in almost every state in the United States now, And the building codes have opened a lot of new opportunities for us. I mean, right here in the US, we have a 25-story mass timber building going up in Milwaukee. So we have 107 buildings that are over the original code limits that now have been opened up to tall wood. So now mass timber can be used up to 18 stories with the new code development. So everything's in place and we are poised really to take this throughout the entire United States. We're just at the very beginning and needing to make sure that people understand how to do this and they have the tools at their disposal to be able to successfully design these buildings. And you're definitely 100% correct in terms of the research. All the testing has been done to safely design these buildings, and you're happy to provide any of that as needed.
Well, I don't think other sectors should feel threatened by this. It's not like it's going to turn development on its ear with concrete or other things, but you know, we love the historic nature of this, that you can still go to Pioneer Square in Seattle and see buildings that were built with wood, and now we could restore, and I can tell you the feeling that you get from walking into one of these facilities is great. So yes, why is the United States ceding to the UK? Nothing against the brilliant work done by the UK researchers and architects there, but hardly they have the land master supply that we do that could be utilized here, particularly because of climate. So I think we should continue to work and find out what other incentives, if it's clarifying the building codes or clarifying the Forest Service ability to do longer term contracts. I just want to keep batting down the barriers on this issue. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Now we have Senator Cassidy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Crowther, Dr. Crowther, I'm sorry. In 2019, the study Global Tree Restoration Potential, you and your colleagues report that approximately 0.9 billion hectares of potential forest land exists for potential restoration, could store 205 gigatons of carbon, in concluding that ecosystem restoration is one of the more effective ways to mitigate climate change. Did you study the restoration of riparian forest and marshland?
So thank you for the question, Senator. It's a really important one, because one of the main caveats to recognize there is that this is a global study, and that means there's major uncertainties around all those things. And what the model does is it's trained using millions of data points of observations of where forests exist now, and it's trained based on the environment and satellite imagery to predict the ecosystems that can naturally exist. Now, riparian ecosystems are moist, riparian regions can be in particularly good conditions for supporting trees. And what we actually find in continued research is that the impact of even a small riparian zone in lowering the water temperatures in aquatic systems can actually be incredibly important for fish production, for the survival of macroinvertebrates in the streams, and for the productivity of those streams for fisheries and extended things. So I've sort of extended beyond your question there, but yes, we evaluated the potential in all global ecosystems.
So I thank you for saying that. I've been told by folks back home at the Water Institute of the Gulf that aquatic and wetland plants can store 3 to 5 times more carbon in flooded soils than terrestrial forests. And so the potential is obviously there. I'll make the point that I continue to push for development of the Outer Continental Shelf oil and gas to provide dollars for Louisiana to restore its coastline. And this is one of the many benefits of Louisiana using that money to rebuild our coastline, and one of the many deleterious effects of choosing not to develop a needed resource worldwide. What has your research shown? Well, let me put it this differently. I understand that in your testimony, you mentioned that monoculture forests, which lack diversity, can be detrimental towards a healthy ecosystem. Diversity directly correlated to resiliency. I want to point out one of my Louisiana universities, Nicholls State, will take acorns from a live oak tree from an area which periodically is hit by hurricanes and salty air, and replant that, and the tree grows. But if they take a live oak acorn, I'm told, from elsewhere, which has not been bred, so to speak, to survive in this environment, that tree dies. So I guess my question is, Does that ring true? And with your kind of concepts, that we should have plants selected for the ability to survive in a certain region as we attempt to rebuild those regions?
Yeah, one of the biggest challenges in effective restoration is knowing the right species must be in the right place. And that doesn't just include the species that can survive in that climate and that soil conditions, but it's also the full range of those species, because a healthy ecosystem does, the stronger and the more diverse the interactions among species, the more sustainable the ecosystem is and the more carbon's captured. We actually did an analysis across the global forest system that suggested that if we were to convert the world's ecosystems from their diverse state into monocultures of the fastest growing species, the impact on the timber industry would be a reduction in productivity by about a third. When you have mixed stands and mixed species, you tend to get a greater productivity and a greater carbon sequestration, simply because they take up different resources. If you're all competing for the same resource, you have a much less efficient access to those resources, like light and nutrients and water. But when you have different species with different rooting depths and different heights, you tend to make more efficient use of those resources, and you support all of the other biodiversity that's important also for the health of the ecosystem. So yes, simply put, we do have to get the right species in the right place. Now, the example you gave is an interesting one. There's a lot of ecological theory about how you can sort of move species around. Sometimes when you have a species that's not from there, it can be released from a lot of the competitive dynamics that it would naturally experience under its parent tree. But in many cases, what we do see is that, yeah, we obviously want to minimize the movement, the sort of human-driven movement of biodiversity, because in most cases, seed banks have enough biodiversity that they'd be able to regenerate a very healthy level of diversity on their own. And so planning for that, and also thinking about the trajectory of those species under a changing climate condition, those are some of the biggest challenges in getting restoration right.
Mr. Chairman, I'm out of time, but I will say that all of us stick up for our own state, and all of us have pride in our own state. I'm giving a shout out to Nichols State and to the Water Institute of the Gulf. But let me also point out that the restoration of Louisiana's wetlands does have national significance, not just for this, but also to support the energy infrastructure that helps prevent another colonial pipeline problem, not from cyber attacks, but from natural disaster, as well as preventing damage to the port infrastructure that allows goods from around the nation to move to around the world at the lowest carbon intensity imaginable, because it travels over water. With that, I thank you all for your testimony, and I yield back.
Thank you, Senator. Now we have Senator Wyden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding the hearing. Having been the chair of the committee, I know it's a challenging job. You got your hands full, and I appreciate working with you. Let me go to you, Ms. Mitsos. Know of your good work. And in our part of the country, it is already very dry, and there is tremendous concern that this dryness can really trigger another round of infernos. This is what people have first and foremost, particularly in rural Oregon, on their minds in terms of what they may have to deal with. We come to this committee, and so much of the time is always devoted to a debate where one side wants to cut everything down in the forest, and the other side, particularly in the West, sometimes says we don't want to cut anything down. And so that just is kind of a prescription for gridlock. And my view is this year, it would be absolute malpractice in this country for this committee and the Congress to not take concrete steps to do more to reduce hazardous fuels and deal with the fire mitigation threat, especially near homes and businesses. So today, we Westerners, Senator Cantwell and Senator Feinstein, we joined with our colleague, the chairman from West Virginia, to really launch a special effort that is backed by good science. It's tested policy that would accomplish that objective of really allowing us to do more to reduce hazardous fuels and mitigate fire. And what it is all about is increasing the pace and scale of prescribed burns. And this effort that we're pursuing is backed by a coalition that you don't see every single day. Earth Justice and the Environmental Defense Fund joining major timber industry leaders, Weyerhaeuser, the National Alliance of Forest Owners, Oregon Tribes, tribal forestry organizations with us as well. So we don't know of any major opposition now because, as I say, it's science-based, really builds on some of the collaborative ideas, and you basically do a lot more during that season before it is hot and dry and before you get to these infernos. Would legislation, in your view, for purposes of my initial question, my legislation with Senator Cantwell, Senator Feinstein, Chair Manchin, would this prescribed fire bill, in your view, reduce wildfire risks and contribute as well to healthy forest management practices?
Thank you, Senator. Prescribed fire is essential on the landscape. We can do thinning, and that will help as well, but it needs to be followed by prescribed fire. So I don't, unfortunately, know the details of your bill, but I know if it focuses on increasing pace and scale of prescribed fire and also helps build the workforce to do that, it is a necessary bill.
That's what the bill is all about. Pace and scale, up in our game. We're going to have to really get serious and get serious quickly about hazardous fuels reductions, fire mitigation, and following the science. And that's what our little coalition of members wants to do. Second area I want to talk to you about is, along with Congressman Joe Neguse in Colorado, we have introduced the 21st Century Civilian Conservation Corps. And the idea here is to establish a larger forestry workforce for planting trees, removing hazardous fuels, and have more healthy forest treatments all across the country. The Biden administration basically worked closely with us. They have something which is sort of the other side of a coin, a climate corps, but they're essentially the same kinds of efforts. In your view, does the United States currently have a sufficient workforce to accomplish the amount of planting and thinning and science-based forestry practices that you have been talking about? Because my sense is we got to have some more people and we got to do it quickly. Your thoughts?
We definitely need more people, whether they be youth or young adults or people just out of college. The number of people who work in forestry in particular and natural resources in general has been dwindling, and without the assistance of building up a new workforce, we're going to struggle with finding new stewards of our lands.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm out of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Next, Senator Risch. Senator Risch or Senator Marshall? If not, I have a couple questions, and then we will wrap up unless we have any other senators that come in quickly. Dr. Crowther, much of what you talked about resonated with me because we do not do much tree planting in West Virginia. Instead, after timber harvest, foresters regenerate stands of trees using natural regeneration. That said, in West Virginia, there are currently over 170,000 acres of unreclaimed abandoned mine lands, and 1 in 3 West Virginians live within 1 mile radius of an AML site. Have you discussed, I'm very interested in bringing economic activity back to these sites, but I also understand that trying to reestablish trees on these sites can be especially difficult. So do these sites represent the types of areas you're considering in your initiative?
Thank you for the question. I actually think it's great that you mentioned that, because a lot of people do think of tree restoration, and when we talk about 1 trillion trees, they think we're talking about planting 1 trillion trees. And physically, that wouldn't really be feasible. That would take all of humanity quite a while. But natural regeneration presents an unbelievable opportunity for regenerating ecosystems, and nature always tends to do it better than we do. More diverse, more resilient ecosystems are there. But you're right, in some regions, previous human activity like mining can lead to degradation of those ecosystems. And in those places, there's been many, many, many examples of how active regeneration can start to tip the balance, and that can, by either managing soils effectively or by integrating the right mixtures of species and giving them a bit of a head start. They can start the regenerating ecosystems can start to tip the balance and make that a more livable environment in the future. So yes, degraded lands are absolutely the central to this. We want there to be as much natural regeneration as physically possible, but where that's not possible, assisting that process can be incredibly valuable.
Thank you very much, Doctor. And now we have Senator Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Ms. Mitsos, I want to start off here by thanking you and the National Forest Foundation for your investment in the Northern Arizona Forest Fund. Since 2015, NFF has partnered with the Salt River Project, which is a water and power utility in the state of Arizona, to restore forest lands and plant trees along the Verde and the Salt Rivers, both of which are very critical water supplies for my state, the state of Arizona. We've had a rather early start to the fire season in Arizona, and we've already been seeing wildfires and a few evacuation orders. Behind me is a Forest Service map of lands that are likely to burn in any given year. These fires often occur on Forest Service land and release many tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The data is clear on this. We have to get serious about ramping up forest restoration and hazardous fuels projects immediately. So, Ms. Mitsos, if the Forest Service established a carbon credit program for forest restoration projects, what could that mean for utilities that are active in forest restoration?
Thank you, Senator Kelly. That's a great question. I think it goes beyond utilities into major U.S. corporations as well. So many corporations are setting their public ESG goals, environmental, social, and governance goals, and carbon offsets are one of the major goals for them. So water utilities, electric utilities, and public corporations would all invest in these kind of efforts.
But specifically for forest restoration, what could that mean?
Well, so we are in the process of right now of developing the first of its kind methodology to account for carbon credits from forest restoration in high fire frequency forests, specifically on the 4 northern forests in Arizona, because they are some of the highest fire frequency forests. We've got probably about 9 months to go to finish the development of that methodology. Once that is accepted and we can offer offsets to corporations, the money is going to flow, I believe.
Thank you, Ms. Mitsos. I want to turn to Mr. Woodkey for a minute here in my remaining time. Mr. Woodkey, as the committee's timber industry representative for the West, so I was in Flagstaff, Arizona recently, and I met with Northern Arizona University's Ecological Restoration Institute. And ERI has spent years studying Forest Service timber policies and identified several reforms for forest restoration project planning and implementation in our Ponderosa pine forests. Our forests are similar to those in Black Hills National Forest, where your members operate. What do you see as barriers, but also what do you see as opportunities to accomplishing this work?
Thank you, Senator. I think one of the first things that we've been hearing consistently today is that you have to have a forest products infrastructure in place to be able to do those treatments, to remove that material from the forest. And Arizona has had some unique challenges there. They've been fortunate to have the four FRI projects in place that aims to treat 2.4 million acres, but treatments have been slow. I believe they've been averaging about 13,000 acres a year for treatment, where the Forest Service is targeting treating 50,000 acres a year. And that's not to say that the Forest Service is doing anything wrong or the company isn't operating correctly, but I think it's indicative of the hurdles and challenges in starting new forest products infrastructure in places where it either hasn't been or hasn't been for some period of time. Of course, there are opportunities to help the Forest Service. Some of that is coming online and being used more. D by P, designation by prescription, virtual boundaries where it can save some time for the Forest Service to do timber cruising and laying out their boundaries. Scaling by weight, where the companies have that ability. Instead of doing the full timber cruising, you can actually look at exactly what's coming across the scales and keep track of making sure that the operators are meeting their prescriptions in the forest. And so we're seeing some of these opportunities being employed more across the nation. There are certainly other ways that can be helpful as well, and just trying to provide some of those efficiencies for the Forest Service to get more done on the landscape. Sometimes at the end of the day, it just takes more. It takes more staffing, it takes more funding to get those activities done. And in places like Arizona, like you're seeing, it takes more infrastructure to make that work. And I'm hopeful that Arizona and many other parts of the West can hurdle some of those challenges here in the future.
Thank you, Mr. Woodkey, and thank you, Ms. Mitsos, for your testimony today, Mr. Chairman.
If we have anybody else on WebEx that I might have missed, please speak up. If not, I want to thank all of our witnesses for joining us this morning for this discussion. It's very enlightening. I would like to say this, that I've had really the pleasure of visiting Mr. Irving's operations, and I've seen proper management compared to a so-called standard, and there was no comparison. And we can do a much better job. With the permission of the committee, I'm going to reach out to the White House and see if we can't get the Forest Service into a different gear to make some practical, common sense decisions on how we take care of America's forest. So, members will have until the close of business tomorrow to submit additional questions for the record. Thank you all. The committee stands adjourned.